Okay, good evening. And I thought I just would begin by reminding you we're in week 10 already, and due this week is the logical analysis of the Pookie text. And I assume that you have been working on that, and hopefully for most of you it's done. Just a few things to note about that assignment. I just thought I would illustrate perhaps with the first 5 sentences, uh, which are really rather easy. I will give you that. What you are doing is you are looking at logical meaning in terms of whether it's paratactic or hypotactic, and also, though, in relationship to the kinds of relations. Now, we've talked about rhetorical structure theory, and rhetorical structure theory, as you're aware, has a number of relations that are defined. Halliday sort of generalized those relations between, for him, it was primarily between clauses, whether it was elaborating, giving some additional information, extending, which would be especially when you have sort of adding on, like when you use a coordinate conjunction like and or, but, sort of expressing addition or alternatives. Enhancing, as we've said before, related to circumstances: where, when, why, how, purpose, condition, concession. And finally, projecting. Projecting as in verbs of mental processes or verbal processes that are projecting ideas. So you are to be identifying the kind of relation, and the examples are illustrated here. Where it would be paratactic in elaborating, it would be perhaps would be punctuated with a colon, in the sense like there are 3 components of meaning, almost like it's 2 different sentences. They are ideational, interpersonal, textual, but here it isn't punctuated as 2 separate sentences, but as 2 clauses that are combined in a paratactic way. Both, why is it paratactic? Because they are both standalone. Grammatically, in that sense, they are equal. The relationship is symmetrical. Unlike a non-defining relative clause, this is my father, comma, who is teaching here. What about a defining relative clause? Well, of course, the defining relative clauses are, by their very nature, embedded. They're post-modifiers of some noun, head noun. So in that sense, they are not even functioning at clause level, so would not be included here in the logical analysis. Let's take some examples then from that first part, those first 5 sentences, and I've sort of tried to color them in a way that gives some illustration. When I'm up here on stage, clearly a dependent clause. The main clause, they call me Brandon. Sentence 2 is the same structure. Sentence 3, very similar. It also begins with, and when I'm with the ladies, again, a dependent clause. But then for the second part, though, it breaks down into additional clauses. Let's just say, well, say is a verbal process, and so what is being said is the projected. They call me taken because I'm already happily spoken for. So let's just say 3C, then 3C and D would be projected by the verb to say. They call me taken. Because, or so that there is a cause and effect relationship. Now that would be, again, a kind of enhancing as we described it. 4, we're in the same structure again. When I'm back at home, my mama, she called me Pookie. And 5, well, 5 then does break the mold. It does break that pattern that we've seen so far in the first 4 sentences. No, I'm not afraid. 5B, to admit it. I'd say that would be enhancing. Purpose. I'm not afraid of what? To admit it. And admit what? Admit, again, you're projecting. Verbal. Admit, my mother calls me Pookie like the most inopportune moments. All right, so take those, and we are going to put them then into our Excel table. So when we consider that when, clearly enhancement. What is the alpha clause? The alpha clause is the main clause. And what is the main clause? It's 1B. 1A is the beta clause. It's the dependent clause. So it's not AB, it's the first clause is the dependent clause. The second 1B is the main clause. And the same pattern in 2. When I'm with my homies, they call me B. 3, a bit more complicated. And here we have, for example, as we've said before, we have again enhancement between the when I'm with the ladies, 3A. B, let's just say, now B and D, B through D, notice that B through D illustrates the combination, okay? When I'm with the ladies, that's the dependent part. 3B, we have someone, okay. There's, let's see, I think there's someone who's online, and we can hear sort of what's going on around you. So I'm going to mute you, all right? Okay, back to, let me get back to where I am, okay. So B through D is sort of the main clause. B is the, as we said, the projecting clause. C through D is what's been projected. C and D are related to each other here again. C, though, is they call me taken. That's the main clause, the alpha clause, and the D, because I'm already happily spoken for. It's the beta. In, again, enhancement. So far, it's all kinds of enhancement. 4, again, it's the same pattern as we've seen in 1 and 2. And then 5. 5 would break down into A, I'm not afraid, B and C together, to admit, and B, projecting C. All right, so again, I hope you can follow along and see how it would be put into the table. And that's what you will be hopefully giving to me by the 24th. All right. All right. So step 4 is the logical analysis. It's due on the 24th. Now you're thinking, I hope, about the commentary, and this will be in getting on into week 12. And 800 words. Now 800 words again is the minimum. All right. Should at least be writing 800 words. This counts 20% of your overall grade, and you're supposed to be making observations on the basis of the data that you've obtained through these previous steps. Your analysis of the text into clauses, theme analysis, transitivity, and the logical. Now again, as I've said before, you can rely on, and I would expect you to rely on, the model that will be uploaded and has been uploaded in the previous steps, and will also be uploaded in the last and final one. So please rely on the model as the basis for then going through and carrying out your analysis and observations in terms of your commentary. I'd like to go back, if I may, to that first text, the puff text, as we've been calling it, that first initial spoken word performance by Brandon Leake that started this all off. You'll notice that what I'm picturing here is a rhetorical structure of the poem. Now, I've not asked you to do this, but I think it would be helpful to you in doing your commentary to be thinking about the overall architecture of the text. It's not one of the assignments, but I think, again, as I just said, it would be very helpful to you to be able to get a picture. Because when you look at the text, you've seen all the theme analysis, transitivity analysis. You got all this data, right? And you got to have an overall picture of what's going on then in the text. Now, how do I map it out? Why did I map out that golden buzzer performance the way I have? So what I'm going to try to go through with you right now is how I did do this sort of rhetorical structure analysis. Now, I've not filled in the kinds of relations. Basically, a lot of it, as you'll notice, is highly paratactic, and that's one of the things that I will be enabled to see by the fact of having done the rhetorical analysis. In other words, I get a picture of what I would see as being the structure of this golden buzzer performance. So let's just take the first 4 sentences. I'm taking those first 4 sentences in that puff text as being sort of providing the background, the introduction to what follows from the 5th sentence onward. So let me go through the first 4 sentences. I have 2 facts for you. That's how it begins. Now you'll notice that what I've put here is the 2 through 4, and I have an arc pointing over to 1. So that means it's a kind of hypotactic relation, where the main sort of the nucleus is 1. I have 2 facts for you. Again, I'm saying that it's a kind of elaboration. That's why I use the equal sign. 2 through 4. 1, I'm 6 feet tall, and 2, love is the most vulnerable thing one will ever have. And you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. All right, so one way in which this could be pictured would be 2 is 1, first fact. 3 and 4 together. And 2, love is the most vulnerable thing one will ever have, and you must learn to hold on to it loosely. What is it? Love. And that's the second sort of related point. And why am I seeing it as paratactic? Well, and. Now notice I'm not going down all the way to clause level here. I'm just looking at it in terms of the sentences. So I'm taking and as a kind of paratactic, kind of conjoining. It's a conjunction relation between 2, 1, I'm 6 feet tall, and 2, what about it? Love. And the rest of it, 3 and 4, are all related to love. 2 points. Love is the most vulnerable thing one will ever have, and you must learn to hold on to it loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. Well, that's how I structured then those first 4 sentences. loosely, painfully, rhyme, noticing the use of the conjunctions. Okay, sentences 5 through 8. Let's take a look. On July 14th, 1996, an angel was brought to this earth. Her name, Danielle Marie Gibson, but I only know her as Puff. Earth, Puff, similar, something of a rhyme here as well. So introducing his sister. That's what sort of ties 5 through 8 together. That's why I put them together as one span, one block. What ties it together? It's his sister. It's about his sister. Now, notice 6, her smile. 7, her eyes. 8, she. All of these pronominal references are referring back to his sister, Danielle Marie Gibson. So again, they are all sort of elaborating with 3 different points. One about her smile, one about her eyes, and the other is his sort of final statement. She is my world and my sister. Now, you might say, could I be doing this differently? Could I be sort of drawing this differently than what you're doing, what I'm doing here? I'm noticing the thematic progression is rather continuous. Her smile, her eyes, she. Now, you could say 6 and 7, they seem to be more equal. Her smile, her eyes, and she is sort of a third point. Well, I still just put them here as sort of joint, listing out 3 related points about his sister. Again, I'm noticing the rhyme. We had loosely, painfully, earth, puff, universe, stars. All right, 9 through 10. Notice something. Why do I take 9 and 10 as separate? The shift to first person. I. Now it's about I. I, just 4 years old at the time, learned what it meant to love selflessly. And then a separate point, again, I took it as paratactic. There's no and or but or anything like that. No conjunction basically to tell me that, but I see it as 2 separate points, equal and rather symmetrical. 10, for on days in which my strength was but knee-high, seeing her smiling face would make my soul fly. Again, rhyme. So we've gone through 1 through 10. We've noticed and I hope you can see, and I hope I've made a case for what I have outlined here. As I've said before, when you're doing this rhetorical structure analysis, there should be reasons behind it, and I am trying to make a case for it. But nonetheless, it is more or less a kind of theory. It's a kind of hypothesis about how I see this text put together. Remember, when we talk about the rhetorical structure of the text, we're talking about the text as a semantic unit, as a unit of meaning. And while the grammar, as we have argued before, gives us hints and gives us some indications, there are some times when it will rely on us to infer the kind of relationship that exists. But hopefully, what I've illustrated 1 through 10 is something that, when I explain it, makes sense to you about it. We come to a crossroads, but. And that but is a very defining but. It seems to shift everything. Because once we get past that but, there is no more rhyme. The parataxis that we've seen and the clause simplicity that we've seen in through 1 through 10 seems also to have gone. And so 11, we now shift our attention after having sort of seen the simplicity of life. His sister, himself, he was 4 years old at the time, and it's all quite simple, quite straightforward. But then after that, well, we know what happens next. We know that she passes away, and that is a defining moment in his life and in the text. Sentences 11 through 13. Now again, why do I see them as sort of related to one another? Well, you'll notice that here the conjunctions lay it all out for us. I mean, the parataxis is very obvious. But on March 23rd, I've been ground bound. Notice the passive voice here. Because she left Earth to go back home amongst the stars right next to God. But I was left here, passive voice, to manufacture wings out of tears and broken dreams. Yet I'm still haunted by these nightmares. I take the beginning of 13a, yet I'm still haunted by these nightmares. And 13b, cause. What's coming in 13? Let's listen just to this part.
I have a really creative mind, and sometimes it designs these alternate realities where she is still here, still alive, and all the things I wish we could have done are played again and again and again, and I'm tired of playing God because I gotta come to terms with the fact that my sister ain't never coming back.
Okay. Now, 13, we notice, we've commented before about the fact that because there are so many clauses that are linked up here, unlike anything we've seen so far, there's this peak, the lexical density, it becomes so many words in this particular sentence, way more than what we've seen before. We notice that in this one sentence, we have, again, cause, B through J, and then we have three ands, and, 3 layers down. We're working our way down here, all right? And then finally, again, come back to cause. Yet I'm still haunted by these nightmares, cause. And then he goes on. I have a really creative mind. And sometimes it designs these alternate realities. And all the things are played again and again and again. And I'm tired. Also, we notice the emotion. The words are related to, again, that sort of the repetition again and again and again, and I'm tired. That frustration comes through very clearly in this particular sentence. We notice the peak. We notice the intensity increases. 14 and 15.
And that's the cost of love. Caring for someone so much that you can't imagine living life without them. Staring at a grave like, how about I trade my 6 feet for yours, but that's not real.
And finally, 15. And, always and, yet highly paratactic. It's, again, similar to like if you were talking, right? And, repeating this. It gives it that spoken feel. And only when we get to 15 does the rhyme return. Previously, 11, 12, 13, 14, no rhyme. But when we get to 15, we're back to loosely, painfully, you. So when we take a look at the text as a whole, then we begin to see that there are patterns here. we notice at the very beginning, I mean, it's rather circular because he starts off to hold these verbs to hold on to, leaves, won't exit. It's said at the beginning and it's said at the end. The repeated mention of being 6 feet tall, the use of rhyme at the beginning and the use of rhyme at the end. So it comes full circle. When we have that shift from active to passive, what's the significance of that? Been ground-bound, was left, haunted. He is the affected. He is not the initiator. It's out of his control. His life's changed by the fact that she left Earth. And in the meantime, he is the affected. We see the conjunctions that so clearly lay out not only a continuation, but also the structure that, like we've been able to sort of now model in that sort of schematic way that we've done in rhetorical structure theory. There are two buts in 11. A but in 11's, well, we know what happens. His sister passed away. And the but in 12, but he is the affected. His life has changed. We noticed already, and I've mentioned before, about how 13 itself is so, just that one sentence, so complicated, and it has so many clauses, and the lexical density is so high. But we also noticed something else about 14 there. It's so hypotactic compared to most of what we've seen so far. Caring, staring, living. 15 as well. It's changed. In other words, the parataxis usually represents a kind of balance, kind of symmetry. What's hypotaxis? There's an imbalance. So his use of the hypotaxis instead of parataxis more or less establishes this kind of imbalance. So I've sort of divided up the text in sort of these parts. We have 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, 13, 14, and 15. I was interested to take these parts then, and I wanted to take a look at something else. I wanted to take a look at how fast he was speaking. And so I took these sections that I've noticed and counted the words that are in each of these sections. Counted how many seconds for that particular block. Found the words per second and then the words per minute. Notice 13. 196 words per minute. And you notice that it's sort of, do you notice that it starts out rather slow? Building, 158, 170, 172, and then that really 13, that which he's not only, yeah, it's a lot of clauses, a lot of words, but it's also being spoken rather quickly. The pace is faster. You have that sense of also that intensity that comes out of that increase in speed. And then it slows down in 14 and 15. But then when you notice in 15, we're back to sort of this similar speed to how we began. And notice the rhyme is returned as well, right? So in that text, what we see building, it builds toward that peak in 13. And that 13, that sentence 13, that really stands out in every respect. this is the kind of thing I'm going to stop here in talking about it, because I want to talk. I'll say a bit more when we meet next week in week 11. But this is sort of the kind of thing I want you to be thinking about with respect to your text. Yeah, you've got the information about theme, clause analysis in terms of transitivity, logical. That's a clause level. That is important, and you're going to be looking for the patterns that exist there. But also enlarge your vision when it comes to the text. Look for the patterns that emerge, and by those patterns coming out, we begin to see how the text sort of is composed into parts. It's hierarchical. It's building, and it's all just sort of constructed together. But at the same time, there is, as you can see very clearly, a beginning. It has the rhyme. It has the balance. It has the simplicity. And when we come back, we circle back to the end. The rhyme is back. It's no longer as simple as before. It's no longer as balanced as before. There is greater hypotaxis. It comes full circle. The beginning is sort of repeated toward the end, but it comes round, but not in the same way as it began. And what matters and what breaks the text is that but. And that but is where the change occurs. So the text is, yes, there is a craft to it. There is a design to it. And that's what I want you to be looking for in that Pookie text. Where's the design? Where's the craft? Where's the artistry? Where is the use of taking the use of language and being able to use it in such a way as to be able to give us a picture of what it is that this artist is feeling, what this artist has in his own mind. And that's what I want you to be looking. Because that Pookie text, it's not about his sister, no, but there is an emotion to it. There is a pain in it as well. And so I want you to be looking for that. So be looking at the text as a whole. Look for, Halliday talks about the personality of the text, right? So be looking for that personality. We've been talking about applied linguistics. Last time I mentioned to you and gave you an example of how I would like to sort of put across to you the fact that we do engage in a linguistics that has applicability in the world in which we live. Halliday sees it not just from the standpoint of being what you need to be clear on when he says applicable linguistics, and why he makes that distinction is it's not just it should be applied, and what we do should have contribute to society. And he's saying also, though, this, that by using our insights into language for the good of society with an application, we will be able to turn it around, and it will provide greater insight into the language itself. By looking at how the insight is applied, it will feed back into our knowledge of language. The theory itself will move forward. He says, I want a general term which gives the sense of something that is capable of having evolved in the context of being applied. In other words, a linguistics that has evolved, that has developed, that has advanced by virtue of having been applied. That is what Halliday's vision is of a linguistics that, because it offers us insights into how we make meaning, that will feed back into our understanding of how language works. What there is that we need to look for in language that is indeed making meaning. Are there other things other than transitivity structure? Are there things other than the logical, other than theme? Certainly. These are to be discovered. The other aspect of it is that what Halliday is saying is that by applying it, then you know if your theory works. Does the theory enable one to answer questions about how language means and how language is valued in actual use? If it doesn't, then what is it good for? Does it enable you to answer these questions about how language means, how it accomplishes its purpose, its function, and how it's valued? Why do we value language, the use of language, differently, respond to it differently? You see, we don't simply ask whether or not a sentence is grammatical. Is it grammatical or not? Now, that's very much what's done in formal linguistics. You throw out a sentence, throw out a clause, and you say, can I say that? And then you try to figure out the sort of logical structure behind it. We don't do that. We don't simply ask, is that sentence grammatical or not? Because form, just the form itself, provides only a partial and unsatisfactory picture of how language works. If you're looking just at the form of language, you do not really get a picture of what language is all about. Instead, we have to look at how language actually works. As we've said before, in context of situation, function is determined by how users respond. What is the function? Backtrack a bit. What is meaning? Meaning is function. How do you know the function? By how users respond, how the listener responds. That will depend on how the user, how the listener perceives the situation of context, how well it fits within the context of situation. Now, for this, you remember last time I wanted to give you an illustration from my experience. And in this case, I was asked to give advice. Now, the defense team, as I discussed with you last time, their question was quite simple. Did the judge talk too fast? That's it. And as a linguist, though, we realized that there's more to it than that. It's more to it than the speed, but speed matters, yes. And speed matters, especially depending on what you're saying. But you'll notice here, that study that I did of the judge's summation of evidence, two things struck me, besides the use of grammatical complexity and so forth, those linguistic features that cause comprehension problems. I was struck by the need to consider lexical density. I was struck by, yes, speed. Do you notice that both of those elements I've now brought back to look at that spoken word performance? You see, our experience working with language, our experience noticing certain things about the text that we're looking at, it feeds back. So we begin to notice it, we begin to pay attention to it in other texts. And so, yes, going back to look at lexical density, going back to look at the speed with which he was speaking, both of those highlighted to me in looking at Brandon Leake's spoken word performance how unique, how separate that sentence 13 was. There are other elements that I am used to looking for, the parataxis, the hypotaxis, those aspects of who is in theme position. It's all about his sister for one block. It's all about him for the next block. Well, yes, all these things do enter into what I'm looking at, but as we look at and as we experience how language is used in more texts, it begins to feed back into our understanding of texts and how they work and how they make meaning and how they come to be valued the way they do. So every kind of analysis that we do, remember what Halliday said, it doesn't matter the kind of text you're looking at. It can be language of science, it can be a children's text, it can be great literature. Every kind of text, we have a way to approach it. And we can compare texts because we have a method, we have an approach. And that's what we have been, those are the tools that have been provided to us. Tools that how meaning is realized, whether it be choices of process type, transitivity, theme, logical structure, lexical density, speed. These are the kinds of things that we pay attention to. Lexical density. Spoken versus written. Halliday, this comes from this book, The Essential Halliday. What I did, I asked Professor Halliday what would he consider to be sort of the essential ideas that basically make up his theory. And so I took those core concepts from systemic functional theory and went through his collected works and identified in each of those, throughout the collected works, where did it talk about that particular concept. So from this particular, the Essential Halliday, we have discussion on spoken versus written language. Halliday says this: writing puts language in chains. It freezes it. So it becomes a thing to be reflected on. It changes the ways that language is used for meaning with. Writing deprives language of the power to intuit, to make indefinitely many connections in different directions at once, to explore by tolerating them contradictions, to represent experiences fluid and indeterminate. Well, it seems like not a very nice picture that Halliday is painting of writing deprives language power to intuit, more or less to think on the spot like that is what he's saying. As he puts it, it is therefore destructive of one fundamental human potential, to think on your toes. But why do we have written language? It creates another potential. No, yeah, it probably getting used to writing our thoughts down, and by doing so, sort of consolidating it, sort of freezing it. Yes, it doesn't leave room, because once it's written, it's fixed and it's there. So then it doesn't allow room to be sort of expanded on and changed and so on. But it creates another potential. It adds something. And what does it add? It adds the ability to structure, to categorize, to disciplinize. It's what we need if we want to advance knowledge, scientific knowledge, learning, education. You see, the point is, spoken and written have their advantages. You cannot sort of put down one and just, oh, spoken is so much better than written. No, it's not. Halliday's saying it. He is not really even saying that. What he's saying is that they both have their purpose. Spoken and written language each have their function. Now, writing, that has changed the way we make meaning. Halliday says it created documentation, the filing of experience. We now have the potential to look things up. It's a technological advancement that has changed the way we use language. It is contributed to the evolution of language and of learning. In so doing, what have we got with written language? Basically a nominalized world with high lexical density, packed grammatical metaphors. It is these features that enable discourse to become technical. Take an example. Such an exercise had the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. Okay, take that as an example. It's a simple clause. It has one verb, had, a relational process. But it has two nouns, two noun phrases, two nominal groups, as Halliday calls them. It's highly lexically dense. The potential, now that is in a way a grammatical metaphor from to be able to. For intrusions, again, another grammatical metaphor from to intrude by the government. In other words, we notice that there are layers, the potential for intrusions by the government. And then we have another, into the legitimate privacy. Private, adjective, turned into a noun, privacy of non-government schools. We have embedding in the sense of, maybe another word better here would be layering. Layering of prepositional phrases that expand on each of these nouns. The potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. Let's call it layering. I don't want to confuse it with embedding like what we've been talking about in terms of rank shifting. Here it's a kind of layering and grammatical metaphor. So that what Halliday ends up saying is that writing and speaking, they are different ways of knowing. Such that, as he puts it, any theory of knowledge and of learning must encompass both. You cannot have if you want to have the advances that you have in terms of knowledge, education, learning, you cannot do without writing. Our understanding, Halliday says, that the social and the natural order depends on both and on the complementarity between the two as interpretations of experience. Halliday emphasized this notion very much, and that is complementarity. There's a complementarity between spoken versus written language. There's a complementarity between words, lexis, and grammar. There are many complementarities that exist within language, within knowledge. Halliday says this: written technical discourse in particular is characterized by rather simple clause and sentence structures. It's the odd aspect of this, that written language, which we usually think of as being highly complex, is characterized by simple clause sentence structures. Why? Because you pack so much into the noun. Each sentence typically one clause. That clause consisting of one or two nominal groups, one of them perhaps governed by a preposition, propped up by a verbal group, usually a relational process. Most typically the verb be. We just saw another one. That was another relational process. Had, remember? The nominal groups, on the other hand, may be enormously long and complex, since all the lexical materials compressed into one or two groups. In spontaneous spoken language, the clause complex becomes extraordinarily long and intricate. If we analyze one of these in terms of its hypotactic, paratactic nexuses, we get a sense of its complexity. Well, that's what you see in Brandon Leake's spoken word performance. Long, intricate, especially 13. Very seldom, he says, we find anything like these in writing. He finally says, what one can say is that the more intricate a given clause complex is, the more likely it is that it happened in speech rather than in writing. There's every bit as much organization in spoken language as there is in written, only it is organization of a different kind. Written language gains power by its density. Spoken language gains power by its intricacy. So when you now go back and you look at Brandon Leake's spoken word performance, how does it measure up compared to what Halliday's been talking about here? Spoken versus written. Of course, it was I'm sure when he wrote it out and drafted it, but is it written to be spoken, to sound spoken? And in what ways does it come across as spoken? This is certainly something that I hope you pay attention to and hope that you consider in looking at, and in your discuss in your commentary. Well, I think that I could go on, but I think it's better we take a break. It's about 5:02, so let's take a break and come back at 5 past the hour, okay? Let's take a break here. Okay, let's take an example to illustrate. If I showed you this and I said to you, what is there is it spoken or is it written? Let me read it first. Although the term postmodern had been in cultural circulation since the 1870s, it is only in the 1960s that we see the beginnings of what is now understood as postmodernism. In the work of Susan Sontag and Leslie Fiedler, we encounter the celebration of what Sontag calls a new sensibility, a new pluralism following the supposed collapse of the distinction between high and popular culture. It is a sensibility in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism. Its rebellion is an attack on the canonization of modernism's rebellion, an attack on modernism's official status as the high culture of the modern capitalist world. What these critics oppose is not so much the project of modernism as its canonization in the museum and the academy. Definitely not spoken, right? Definitely written. And this was a point I was also making last week when we were talking about the judge reading the summation. He wrote it not to be read. It wasn't like drafted to be a spoken word performance. No, it was written so that he then, as required in the court, would be able to read it aloud. But what he was reading was essentially written text, much as I just did here. Now, difficult to follow, not just because we are perhaps not aware of the academic background to the nature of the text and the field and so forth. That's certainly part of it. But there's aspects of the grammar, not just the lexis, that make it difficult to understand. What is it about this text that makes it so obviously written, not spoken? Well, let's take a look, and let's resume the share. What are we looking for? Well, first of all, there are no references to the writer anywhere. Not I say or I'm telling you or anything like that. The writer is basically, the author is non-existent. There is a frequent use of embedding. Now, what do we mean by embedding? Here is really what usually I've been meaning by embedding, and that is creating a clause that functions within sort of a nominal group. And the examples here, for example, what is now understood as postmodernism, as the object of the preposition of. What Sontag calls a new sensibility, again, another object of the preposition of. What these critics oppose as the grammatical subject of this sentence. In other words, we call it nominalization too, not in the sense of turning a verb into a noun, but turning a clause into something that basically functions like a noun would, as the object of a preposition or as the grammatical subject. Rank shifting. Lexically dense noun phrase structures, heavy post-modification. It is a sensibility in revolt against the normalizing function of modernism, an attack on the canonization of modernism's rebellion, an attack on modernism's official status as the high culture of the modern capitalist world. We saw examples of that just a moment ago. In other words, a layering of post-modification, extending what we're trying to pack into that noun phrase to modify the head noun, a lot of information. So that the noun phrase, or again, Halliday calls them not noun phrases, he calls them nominal groups, become highly lexically dense. Plus, what else? Well, yes, a lot of words that are nominalized. They are verbs. Essentially, they come from verbs, circulation, beginnings, work, celebration, sensibility. The list goes on. You got the idea. What are we looking at? Frequent use of embedding, lexically dense noun phrase structures, nominalized vocabulary. These typically are found in the language of writing, the language of science, the language of academia. But not just academics use language like this. It has become so predominant throughout our culture, so that when we write, basically, this is how we write. So I do want you to be well aware of the difference between spoken and written language. They are different in terms of what their advantages and disadvantages. They are different in their purpose. They are different in terms of kinds of grammatical features that we see that typically predominate in one mode or the other. I want to continue with another example today of how we can apply the kind of linguistics that we've been doing and the kind of linguistics that we've been doing, the text linguistics, the analysis of text, following pretty much a systemic functional model. What I want to do is I want to introduce to you, I've presented this before. I presented this for the Martin Center for Applicable Linguistics at Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and I wrote up a journal article on this as well. And what I was doing is I was introducing the way in which I developed a course here at CityU in our department, Linguistics and Translation. And this was a course that was to be taught to first-year incoming undergraduate students. And the course title is Discovering How Language Works in a University Setting. What are the aims of this course? And this is what I present as the aims of the course. How can you distinguish between good writing and bad writing? How can you get your point across more effectively? How can you improve your writing? In this course, we explore how the resources of language are used to make meaning and make it more effectively. We apply a functionally oriented approach to the study in comparison with examples of gold standard academic discourse, academic publications, international journals. The goal is to help students to improve their writing. The course primarily addresses functional discourse aspects of students' written work, goes beyond surface level grammatical structures to consider issues related to cohesiveness, coherence, genre appropriateness in the text. Basically, what I'm taking is the way my interest in text linguistics, turning it around to try and develop a course that I can then apply my text linguistics, my approach to language, to helping students improve and be able to write better in a university setting. How are we going to approach this? The aim is to develop the following qualities. Students should be grammatically aware. They should be intentional. And they should be persuasive. How to make students grammatically aware how they're writing. They should be intentional. How they're expressing what they want to say, how that intention comes through. And finally, how they can be persuasive, how they can argue more effectively. Now, the way that we structured this course was based on a project in which we carried out in collaboration with the University of Sydney. This goes back a few years. We developed something at CityU, at the president of CityU at the time, different president, was very, very concerned with students writing. And he was concerned, he said, the medium of instruction is English, but many of our students do not write very well in English. And so he committed some funding to the purpose of being able to improve students' writing. How can we do that? The feeling was that it should be in the context of students' own academic work. In other words, not just send them off to the language center to improve their writing, but actually for the assignments that they are writing in their own coursework. Is there a way, this is what the president at the time was asking, is there a way that in their own active writing for their own subjects, whether they're engineers or they're in law or they're in English or whatever the subject that they are majoring in, is there a way that their writing for that coursework can be coached, they can be given advice on how to improve it, can be helped along. So we introduced what we call the Language Companion course. Now this was basically to come alongside the subject teacher, a teacher in engineering or a teacher in law, a teacher in business. We come alongside. And the writing that the students do for their subject, they will be given advice on how to improve it, how to improve the language aspect of it. Now, who's going to do this? We wanted to do it in a way that sort of maximized the resources available to us. So what we decided to do was I approached the University of Sydney. I approached Professor Jim Martin at the University of Sydney. You might remember the name, Professor Jim Martin. He is also one of the major leaders in systemic functional linguistics. I approached him and asked him this: would you have available postgraduate students? They're studying in applied linguistics. They're learning how to teach English to second language speakers of English, ESL. Do you have students who would be available to go online and to be online mentors, online coaches for our students? In other words, what we ended up doing was the student would submit a draft of their coursework. They'd submit it online. An online coach, a postgraduate student studying in applied linguistics. So it was very relevant to their purposes as well. Would be giving advice to the student, would be suggesting how to improve their writing, giving them some coaching. So it was online coaches, and these online coaches would be themselves postgraduate students, and we had some that were from the University of British Columbia in Canada. We had some that were from universities in the US, and we had students, postgraduate students from the University of Sydney. These online coaches then, well, we had to have sort of a consistent way of giving advice. The University of Sydney, Professor Jim Martin and the team that was working there came up with this sort of rubric. We called it the Language Companion course. They called it Scaffolding Literacy in Academic and Tertiary Environment. It was called the LCC Slate Project. Now, take a look, if you would, on your screen. You see the rubric. And you should notice some things are familiar. First of all, let's take a look at sort of the rows and the columns. You'll notice that in terms of the columns, we have a matrix, a 3x3 matrix. 3x3 social activity, genre, register, the whole text. Then we have the discourse semantic, the various phases of a text. And third and finally is the grammar and the expression, the clauses and the sentences. So we have sort of the text as a whole, the phases of a text, and the clauses and sentences, the grammar and expression that was used. On the side, what do you see? The metafunctions. Okay, let me sort of take away a bit of the text so that the noise from the text itself doesn't intrude. We have the genre, we have the register. It's also, in a sense, the context. We have the semantics, the discourse semantics, how the discourses are laid out, the phases. And finally, we have the grammar and expression, how it is grammatically realized. So we have sort of the strata. Remember, we talked about the various strata. We have the context, we have the semantics, we have the grammar. So really, our columns are like the strata. Now come back to the discourse semantic. That's the metafunctions, where you're familiar now. You're very familiar with the metafunctions, and those are our rows. So we have ideational, interpersonal, textual. What are the metafunctions? Well, we've talked about these, and you should have them memorized and in your head permanently, all right? And the wording, what goes along, what lexicogrammatically, how are they realized? What is the experiential process, participant, circumstance? This you're familiar with. Now, you might say, are you actually teaching these undergraduates this? This is the basis. This is the basis. But yes, in a way, it's part of the idea is to make students aware of different kinds of meaning and the way in which these meanings are realized. And so I do, yes, the rubric is at the beginning when we had the Language Companion course and the Slate project, and we're working with the online coaches. This was intended for the coaches. The coaches use this as a guide for what they should be paying attention to and pointing out to the student. But here I'm going to turn it around a bit, and I'm going to take this, and I provide that rubric to the undergraduate students when they they take the course with me. First of all, the goal, remember, is to make them grammatically aware. Now, what does that mean, grammatically aware? I think you should have a pretty good idea. Let's, to focus on this, let's go through some of the cells in this rubric. And I'm going to focus on ideational meaning and its grammar and expression, all right? Let me expand that a bit. Elements within noun groups effectively describe and classify specialized terms, classifying adjectives, defining clauses. In other words, how the noun group expands, how it classifies, how it defines. But you notice something? What is this? What goes into a noun group? The participants, right? When you look at a clause and you're expressing an idea, you have participants. You have circumstances. The prepositional phrase are used to specify location of time, place, etc., where necessary. And what's left? The verb groups. And so, yeah, basically, the focus is to let the students know that there are these three elements that they need to be paying attention to in terms of the idea that they want to get across. We have the noun groups, the participants. We have the circumstances, the prepositional phrases. We have the process, the verb groups. Express processes relevant to the genre, whether it's defining, classifying, cause and effect, or reporting. So this is the first thing, to get the students thinking about how to, yes, think grammatically in terms of participants, process, circumstances. Okay, let's take an example here. This is a sample of students writing. Climate change may have adverse impact on the species. Some people think that from the impact of the recent forecast of climate change will reduce the impact of a warrant to wild animals, and planning for mitigation is prudent now. In other words, this student, this sample that we see here, this was a student actually writing for one of their courses. And you can begin to see that there are issues here, right? Let's take that second sentence. Some people think that from the impact of the recent forecast of climate change will reduce the impact of a warrant to wild animals, and planning for mitigation is prudent now. Well, planning for mitigation is prudent now. There's some sort of nominalization and so forth going on. So the student has some ideas, but some things we need to correct. For example, one of the points would be to talk about the fact that the mental process think is rarely used in academic writing. Some people think. Notice the subject. From the impact of the recent forecast of climate change. Now that's here, the grammatical subject, but you need a participant, not a circumstance, as the grammatical subject. So they have to think about it in terms of who are the participants, what are the circumstances, what is the process. Another aspect of this is also in thinking in terms of ideational meaning. The main clause is a mental process. The censor is some people. Well, in academic writing, you'd need to be more specific. So there are a few things to think about here in terms of how that sentence is written. let's go on. Let's look at it from the idea of the textual meaning. Again, look at it from the standpoint of textual meaning, grammar, and expression. What would you talk about in terms of textual meaning and in terms of grammar and expression? Theme. Yes, introducing students to the idea of theme and how it orients to the topic, how choices that might be marked theme notice shifts in orientation. So I introduce students, yes, to the concept of theme and new information. And what is theme? How do they begin the clause? And I talk to them about the kinds of thematic progression, like we've discussed in this course. Linear, continuous. Another aspect of textual meaning in terms of grammar and expression, grammatical metaphor. How it is used to rework processes, qualities, logical relations as abstract entities in relationships, using nominalization to express processes as nouns rather than as verbs. Again, I use some of the examples that I've used with you in terms of how you can take something that would be expressed with verbs and a number of clauses and then repackage it in a different way, turning those verbs into nouns. Again, things that I've also been talking about with you in this class. But here, I'm talking about it with undergraduate students who are not yet assigned for their major and who are wanting to learn how they can write better. Now, one of the things that we used in this course was an application. Now, this application was developed out of a project, and there were a number of people that were involved in the project. I don't know if some of you might know Dr. John Lee, and he was one of the collaborators. And the idea of the project was to develop a kind of software that would help students. And it was specifically looking at the use of grammatical metaphor. It's called Formal Writer. And one of Dr. Lee's PhD students helped develop this software. He basically did most of the, if not all of the programming. I used to do some programming many years ago, but since that time, I leave it to those that are young and able to be quite up to date in terms of the latest in computing technology. So Dr. Saberi now, Dr. Saberi developed this Formal Writer, and we tried it out with students in this course. And one of the things was how to take informal words and turn them into a more formal, appropriate use of language. So for example, a student could enter into the text here, as you see on the screen, and the student would get an output that would suggest to the student perhaps some alternatives. Rather than say, if you're looking for, change it, if you're seeking. The best way to train your system, a learning management system, is what you have been looking for. Drop out the contractions. Instead of say a couple of, use several, things like that. But the really interesting part of this Formal Writer was the nominalization. Called it a nominalizer. And that is where the student might enter something. You see it on the left of your screen. They educated girls, so women acquired the vote. And the output would be some suggestions. Now, a student would have to choose. So instead of the educated girls, their education of the girls. Then possible verbs to express the relationship that is expressed by so. there, all right? Caused. Women acquired the vote because of the acquisition of the vote by women was a result of their education of the girls. So it suggested several possible results. The idea being that students could sort of play with it a bit to give the idea and to sort of reinforce the idea that nominalization is an important aspect of academic writing. And so we had this formal writer supporting what we were doing in terms of what I'm doing in terms of teaching the students about the importance of nominalization. All right, now, the first part was sort of the background, how the students actually get involved. And the first step in sort of the learning cycle was to learn by deconstructing. And this is taking the teaching learning cycle, and this has also been developed by people from working with Professor Jim Martin. The first step in this cycle is deconstruction. And so the students have a task to begin with, and this task is called a deconstruction task. They're to do a written assignment, and they're focusing on grammatical and thematic analysis. This counted 30% of their grade. This was their first assignment. Now, when the students entered the course, the first thing that I did was I asked them to take a diagnostic test text. What that meant was they were given a text and they were asked a question and they were to write a response. Now, the written response was their diagnostic test text. The first assignment they have is to revise that diagnostic test text. And then their revision should be somewhere between 300 and 350 words. Now, they are also to analyze their revised text, and they're to analyze it for clause and thematic structure, including thematic progression. Yes, similar to what I've been teaching you, I'm asking students who are undergraduates, first year of university, and I'm introducing them to these notions of clause structure, theme structure. And I ask them to then discuss how the thematic choice and progression contributes to the coherence of their writing. Now, you may be thinking, wow, this is pretty difficult stuff. Here's a sample. On the right, you can see the student's original diagnostic test text. The diagnostic test itself is on the left-hand side. That was the actual diagnostic test. That was taken in the first lesson. And the student wrote out what you see on the right-hand side here. Now, what I'm asking them to do is I'm asking them to take that and basically rewrite it and then analyze their rewriting in terms of theme and clause structure. And not only to analyze it, but then to discuss how their choices of theme relate to the coherence and cohesiveness of the text. Here's a student's response. That same student who we just saw his diagnostic test text. Now, this is his revised text, and that is what you see here on the left-hand side of your screen. That is what he writes now. That's on the left-hand side. Left-hand side is, and he used the coloring to identify textual themes, ideational themes, displaced themes. That's on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is the student's own discussion of his choices of theme. It's to make students grammatically aware aware of the clause structure. Do they have, who are the participants? Who are the processes? What are the processes? What are the circumstances? Yes, that's the clause structure. Theme, and how does it relate to the coherent structuring of the text? So this is the students, this is the actual student's first assignment. Okay, so we can see the text on the left. Let's take a look at something of what the student wrote on the right-hand side. In the first sentence, the student writes this: Clause 1A employs a cleft construction where the grammatical subject, 1B, receives focus in order to highlight the new argument about the society. 1A employs a cleft construction, it is well recognized, where the grammatical subject, 1B, that the society is fundamental to social life as it provides, and he goes on to explain. So, creates a new argument about the society. 1C justifies 1A, as indicated by the textual theme as. Also, the society in 1B becomes thematic in 1C. It, linear thematic progression, ends with information about a sustainable environment. Yes, I was impressed too. The student able to think through the choices that the student is making. Sentence 3 ends with information about social institution. This becomes thematic in clause 4. Clause 4 ends with information about the state, which becomes ideational themes in 5 and 6, linear progression, also addressing the same topic. The two ideational themes show continuous progression, indicating the symmetric relationship between 5 and 6 as the justification of clause 4. This symmetric relationship is also highlighted by textual themes in clause 5 on the one hand and clause 6 on the other hand, suggesting two distinct perspectives for comprehension. No, I did not write this. This is the student's own writing. This is the student's own first assignment. Not only is it well written, it is also clearly thought out in terms of the kind of grammatical structures. Now, do we do this all the time when we write? But the point is, yes, to try to train ourselves, maybe not with this degree of explicitness, but to begin to think in terms of the clause structure, the thematic structure. This is thinking grammatically. And this is the deconstruction. You're taking it apart. You're deconstructing your own writing. And this is what the students were doing. Okay, let's carry on. Let's go back to ideational meaning. And let's not look at just the grammar, but let's look at other things. Other things that, of course, come up in academic writing. How does the writer express the technical, specialized, formal knowledge of the discipline? Yes, you need to know the technical language. And I introduced them to this text. And I asked them this question: how does the writer express the technical, specialized, formal knowledge of the discipline area? Of course, the point to be made is that you do need to know the technical jargon of the subject that you are talking about. And this will be expected. You need to know that you are aware of the way in which the technical terminology that is being required in that discipline. What else? Also in terms of ideational, but this in terms of the semantics. How is the information extended across phases? General to specific, points elaboration, evidence interpretation, claims evaluation. I also introduced the students to the ideas of rhetorical structure theory. the idea that there is an organization in the text, that there is a sense of unity. This is the intentional part. This is, what is your intention? What are you writing? How are you going to explain it? The idea that you have to have some conscious, specific goals in mind in terms of what you want to write. And the unity that is there in the text will derive from the writer's purpose. There is a hierarchy. There is a way in which it is built up and established. These points I've already introduced to you for rhetorical structure theory. I won't go into all of these again. We've been, but I want to make the point. Yes, this is also part of what I was teaching them. So this comes to the next point. I want them to be intentional. I want them to be thinking through how they are going to explain, how they are going to put across their argument within the text. Well, this was the second assignment. And the second assignment was joint construction. Learn by constructing together. Teamwork. I haven't required it of you guys, but I did require it of these students. They learn by constructing together. A joint construction task. And this required them to work as a team. And what I asked them to do was I asked them to write an abstract for an academic paper and afterwards, explain the architecture of their abstract. So they get a written assignment. And in this case, the abstract was to be 500 words. And then they were to explain, they were to talk about it. How is the architecture of their abstract? How was it put together? The point being that they were be given an academic paper, and basically they were to mirror the academic paper in terms of their abstract. Now, this was the text that I given to and just showed you a moment ago. All right, so here is the students. Again, on the left-hand side. This is the students writing. This is the abstract that was done by this one group of students. And on the right-hand side is their explanation. Plus, they drew a map of their rhetorical structure. Yes, these are first-year undergraduate students, all right? They're not from linguistics. They don't enter having studied linguistics before. The students, this team wrote this. First published in 1915, Kafka's The Metamorphosis is one of the world's greatest works of literary art. And what they said here is the first paragraph serves as an introduction. Clause 1 introduces the background information about the Metamorphosis. Clause 2 through 4. I won't read the text, I'll read the explanation. Clause 2 raises the topic, various theories for interpreting metamorphosis. This prepares readers for 3 and 4, which state the aims of the essay, to provide 3 perspectives for interpretation, to take into consideration further possible insights in its original language and the work's underlying humor. That was the second assignment. Now, I know I've gotten to about 8:50 now. If you don't mind, I'd like to keep going. I'd like to finish this topic before we take a break. I'm getting near the end, you can see. Persuasive. What does it mean to help them to be more persuasive? And this comes down to the interpersonal, of course, right? So what were some of the points that were entered into this rubric related to the social activity, the genre, and the register, so to speak, and interpersonal meaning. Text convince the reader by moving points or positions forward across the stages. The language presents points and arguments in authoritative, impersonal, and objective ways. How can one's writing be authoritative, impersonal, and objective? Yes, this comes down to tenor. Semantics. The subject matter is evaluated according to institutional values. How are you evaluating the text? How do you make comments about something, its relevance, its validity, its significance? How do you use authoritative sources? How do you include and control the voices of external sources to develop points, guide the reader towards their preferred position? Grammar. Interpersonal objective metaphors. In order to express an opinion and a recommendation, you can say something like, it is clear that, there is a need for, not I think, or you should. Source materials incorporated into the text through correctly formed quotes, paraphrasing, summarizing, how to cite sources. And so I give them some examples from journal articles. For example, questions remain. When you say that, questions remain, what are you doing? You are really putting doubt without expressing sort of your own opinion about something. You are planting the seed of doubt by saying questions remain. It's evaluating. It is clear. Yes, we just saw that, an example of an interpersonal grammatical metaphor. So this was the last assignment the students had to do. Independent construction. They've learned by deconstructing, joint construction, now independent construction. And in this individual construction task, one piece of individual writing, 1,000 words, I asked them to read a lecture that was given by Professor Halliday. The title of the lecture was Language Evolving, Some Systemic Functional Reflections on the History of Meaning. And the question I asked them is, discuss those factors which Halliday identifies as having influenced the evolution of meaning potential of languages. Is language evolving for better or worse? In other words, they are not only to discuss what Halliday wrote, what Halliday's lecture was about, not only present Halliday's view, but also respond to the question themselves. Is language evolving for better or worse? So they're to make a case. They're to put forward an argument, but based on what they have heard and to respond to this authoritative source, namely Halliday, and the lecture that he gave. Here's the lecture.
I mean, even within one language, we can see kind of new patterns in the integration of the meta functions, right? Because meanings are now often packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks to accommodate the reduced space on a small screen and perhaps the reduced attention span of today's interactions. Now, this means it's a curious consequence of this. It means that both interpersonal and textual meanings take on a new prominence, although for different reasons. The textual in integrating these various semiotic strands, with the interesting consequence that it becomes less explicit in the text. You know, it's rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie, sort of thing. The interpersonal, on the other hand, becomes more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized. Just for example, on our television screens of Parliament in Canberra, we are never shown parliamentary debates, only the ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought to make good television. So the whole of politics in that way is simply personalized and individuated. Now here, of course, you can hear the interpersonal component intruding into my own text, because it is clear that I don't like to find so much of meaning reduced to a series of bite-sized chunks. And I don't like the way that any thoughtful discourse by those we have elected to govern us is overtaken by verbal brawling. And I blame the media for it. You can hear the scare quotes just now when I referred to good television. Now, okay, this is just one small symptom, not in itself important, but then we are told that symptoms never are. I'm doubtful about this. But it is symptomatic of a process that I talked about somewhere else as the destruction of knowledge. A destruction of knowledge which, as an old-fashioned socialist and lifelong Marxist, I see as part of the death throes of what is now corporate capitalism.
All right, now that was the, this was a lecture that was presented at a conference in July 2010. At the time, it was thought that might be the last time he would be presenting a major address. And it's also something I included in the Collected Works, Volume 11, Halliday in the 21st Century. So the students had the full video. That was just a clip of it, short clip of it. And they had the written text. So they had the spoken, which he, as you can see, he wrote it out and he was reading it. But even when it was later put into the Collected Works, it had to be reworked again, because it was really going to be in terms of writing, not spoken. And when he, this was the case for Professor Halliday, when he did present, it was more or less like almost a spoken word performance. He used no PowerPoint. No technology. But still, he was able to present it in a way, and this was an extended lecture, and you could follow easily what he was saying. And it was because he knew very well how to be able to get across his ideas in a way that one could follow, one could listen. So then, yes, when it came time to include it in the Collected Works, it had to be reworked in order to put it really back into a written kind of mode. So then this was the assignment. They were to write on what Professor Halliday was saying. What are the factors that influence the evolution of the meaning potential of languages? And it is not just that little bit, but the whole text, the whole lecture. And then respond to the question, is language evolving for better or for worse? All right, this was what the student wrote. This is one of the students. The student wrote this: as a unique human attribute, language has its history. Halliday, so the student is learning how to introduce the sort of the authoritative voice. Halliday explored the evolution of the meaning potential of language. He identified that the advancement of meaning potential is accumulated in speakers' interaction with their eco-social environment, during which language's inner essence evolves from spoken to written, then to standard and global language. In this process, Halliday proposed. So here he's using those authoritative voices. He's summarizing. He's telling you what was Halliday saying. Halliday proposed a number of factors to the evolution of meaning potential and expressed his worry regarding the current trend of language use. Continues. Accompanying the simplification of language is the deterioration of meaning potential. This is a student's writing. Again, I remind you, this is an undergraduate. This is a first-year student, not yet decided the major. Halliday, 2010, identified in the current patterns of meaning promotion of interpersonal themes and demotion of textual themes as arguments become increasingly trivialized and personalized, whereas coherence in the process of authentication becomes marginalized. This deterioration results in what Halliday called the destruction and polarization of knowledge. Verbal brawling is taking over thoughtful discourses where knowledge is destructed as reasoning is gradually dispensed. At the same time, knowledge becomes polarized. Instead of empowering individuals, the information age is on the contrary enlarging the disparity between the knows, the elite, and the don't knows, usually the mass, who are now not only deprived of knowledge itself, but also the ability to know. Simplified knowledge culminates in simplified knowledge. Therefore, a trivialized conception of world, social values, and notions are undermined in the abuse of abstract nouns, whose meanings dissolve as they become applicable to almost all contexts. Simplified language also culminates in simplified opinions. Therefore, a polarized society, conducts are polarized into absolute good and evil. Ideologies are polarized into absolute right and wrong, while the individuals are polarized into absolute victims and perpetrators. Yeah, it was very well written. That's the nature of the course. And you will notice that there are, certainly the way that I do text linguistics is what I brought to this course. And I know that most would feel that this would be, oh, how can you teach that to undergraduate students? How can they follow? That's the advantage here, though, because what Halliday is talking about is the way we make meaning, and it's just making explicit the resources that there are in language that make this possible. And so I'm trying to make students grammatically aware, intentional in the way they write, and finally to be effective, to be persuasive in their writing. This is this SLATE rubric, which was again developed by the people at University of Sydney. I really appreciate how what they've brought together are the strata and the metafunctions. Realizing what there is in terms of how this contributes to what we are trying to teach in terms of how to write more effectively, how to write more appropriately. One of the questions that was asked on the chat was the more nominalization, the better. Well, you have to sort of look at the text to see whether or not it is getting across your point most effectively. Nominalization is not just for the sake of nominalizing. It is to package things so that what you've been discussing, you can package it and you can put it then at the beginning of the next clause and allow that sort of thematic progression to take place. For many, it has, yes, in many cases become, sometimes we might even consider overused, but it is a point to be able to be aware of and be able to know how to use it, when to use it. The teaching and learning cycle. This is another element of looking at the writing and getting students to sort of look at their own writing, critically looking at it, deconstructing it grammatically, working together so that their intentions become aware of what they're saying, and then being able to put this all together finally in their own independent construction. One student wrote this in the feedback. Student wrote this: I especially enjoy reading Halliday's talk. Before taking this course, I was quite disappointed at linguistics because I thought it would be related to philosophy, but it appeared to be a program to train English teachers based on the course I took in this year. After taking LT1202, I regained confidence in the subject because I got a rough feeling linguistics is an aspect of a larger and higher project. I call it the study of humankind. This student got it. They understood it. They understood what's the point. When we look at text linguistics, the idea here is not just to be able to take apart text and find out what's the theme and what's the process and a logical structure and all those things. It's to really get to know how we make meaning. It is to be able to get to know how we use language to evaluate others, how we are able to use language to be able to get across what we want to say, to serve that purpose, that function that we want to achieve. And to have that ability to achieve what it is you want to achieve in and through language. I am pleased in terms of looking at how students responded in this course and what I feel they came away with. I hope that it indeed helps them on in terms of their writing and being able to be not just better students, better at being able to express themselves in the academic context, in a university setting, and outside as well. So this is another example of applicable linguistics. Okay, I have another topic I will move on to, but we have, let's see, the time. Whoa, 9:07. Oh, I think we have a little bit of time left, but let's see, it's about 10 after 9. So let's indeed take a break, and let's come back if we can at 9:20 and see if I can wrap up this one subject, this one topic in the remaining time. Okay, let's take a break to something different and take a look at a text. I've mentioned one of the U.S. presidents, Richard Nixon, before, and we looked at. You remember his text when he left the White House and he was speaking to the White House staff. We call that the departure speech. We've also compared Nixon with Obama and with Trump. Nixon, yes, he resigned and he was, but he was considered an effective speaker. Now, this is the resignation speech. I want us to take a look at the text itself. Now, when Nixon decided to resign, this was because of the Watergate scandal, and I'll say a bit about that, and I have a video about that. He was left with what he considered to be his only course of action, all right? He told his chief of staff to tell his speechwriter that he wanted to work on a statement. And as he put it, it was not a breast-beating mea culpa, not really saying, I'm sorry, not a speech proclaiming guilt. He did not feel guilty, but he wanted a healing speech. One that he said he would hope would help rally the country to his successor. Well, what was the reason for Nixon to resign? Let's take a look.
It was a political scandal that changed our country forever, beginning with the break-in at Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office complex, and ending in the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Tonight, on the eve of the 45th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, we take an in-depth look at the events that led to his downfall.
The president is going to address the nation and presumably announce his resignation in a half an hour from now.
People will be at television sets and radios tonight to hear what the president has to say.
This is the political crime story of the century.
In just a moment now, the President of the United States will begin his speech, perhaps his last speech from the White House.
He always saw enemies. He always saw people in the shadows. And his motto, I believe, was, do unto others before they have a chance to do unto you.
That's enough.
There was an obsession with leaks. You don't blame the leaks when facts come out that are showing wrongdoing.
No, there will be no picture.
This is the funny thing. Had it not been for Watergate, I think this man could have gone down in history as one of the more significant presidents in the history of this country.
Out. You don't have to stay, do you?
We were witnessing the implosion of an American presidency.
The president has taken his place at the table in the White House where he's going to speak. Here now, the next picture will be the President of the United States.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It was the scandal that took down a president, a plot of lies, espionage, and secret dealings that shattered how the nation viewed the presidency and the truth. It all started here, the now infamous Watergate office building, when police were called to investigate a strange break-in.
I was a sergeant assigned to the people on the street, called us the bum squad.
What I looked like in 1972 was like a junior Charles Manson.
Georgetown, Friday night going into Saturday is always crazy back then.
On June 17, 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex. This was the start of what would be the political crime of the century.
At the center of it all were two men, G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-FBI agent who had been hired by President Nixon's campaign to run covert operations. He recruited James McCord, the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president.
And the plan was to get negative information about the potential nominee of the Democratic Party. But how are you going to get the negative information? A lot of people would say breaking into the Democratic National Committee was way out, off the charts. Yes, but not that far off.
McCord would go into the Watergate building and put in tapes in the door.
It was taped, so it would not lock.
The hero of that night was a man named Frank Wills. Frank Wills was the security guard at the Watergate office building.
You found the door taped once, and you took the tape off. And then you found it taped a second time.
It was something that told me that you should check, not only check the door, but that you call the police.
About 1:52 in the morning, the call comes out for an alleged burglary at the Watergate Hotel. I just kind of blinked my eyes. Yeah, we'll take the call. I had on a old funky golf cap. I think I had just like a T-shirt underneath, trying to give me the image I wasn't a police officer.
If a uniformed car had answered that call, it could have been a whole different ballgame.
There's a lookout. Alfred Baldwin was supposed to warn the burglars if there's trouble. The police unit that responds to the call, they're not dressed like police officers. So Baldwin doesn't even notice them.
Our adrenaline is pumped. We get to this room here. I kick the door open.
I pulled my revolver.
Baldwin was supposed to be the lookout across the street.
He was watching a show called Attack of the Puppet People. By the time Alfred Baldwin had notified them, it was too late, and they had to run and hide like rats. We're rolling down this hallway, checking the offices on both sides of the hallways, make sure that nobody's hiding from behind us. I was startled by an arm hitting next to the glass on the petition. It scared the living bejesus out of me. I screamed something to the effect, come out with your hands up or I'm gonna blow your head off. 10 hands went up, and they came out, and that's where the arrest occurred, right here. The 5 burglars that were arrested inside the DNC, McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez. This was not your normal, typical burglary. There was bugging devices, tear gas pens, many rolls of film, locksmith tools, thousands of dollars in $100 bills consecutively ordered.
Who goes into the Democratic National Committee looking for money or looking for jewels? No, you go looking for political information. And who wants that? Why, your opponent, naturally.
People weren't saying, oh my God, this is clearly going to implicate Richard Nixon. It just seemed bizarre. It would take some enterprising young journalists to ferret out the importance of the story.
Woodward and Bernstein were assigned to this burglary just as a matter of routine.
Editors kind of said, we got this strange burglary.
They were young reporters trying to make their way up the ladder in the Washington Post.
When you talk about the people who made a difference when it came to Watergate, you talk about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
They sent me to the courthouse where the 5 burglars caught in the Democratic headquarters were being arraigned. The judge asked the leader, James McCord, where did you work? And McCord went, CIA. It was stunning.
And they discovered that McCord was a security chief for the committee to re-elect the president. Well, okay, folks, this was a political break-in.
There was a notebook belonging to one of the burglars that had the name in it, H. Hunt W. House. And of course, it turned out to be Howard Hunt, who had worked for the CIA, who had been hired at the White House, really to undertake dirty tricks.
You knew that this smoke that was billowing up from the Oval Office, there had to be some fire there.
It's like the Dylan song, it don't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary attempt and said it was nothing the president would ever be concerned with.
Richard Nixon is obstructing justice from the beginning. But what would be known as the smoking gun was when he approves a plan to use the CIA to blunt an FBI investigation into the money that the burglars had. It's clear in the conversation this is being done for political purposes, basically to save the skin of the White House, and the president says he approves it.
Woodward and Bernstein had scores of sources, but there was one source that was special. A guy really high up. He was known as Deep Throat.
We would learn years later that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, number 2 at the FBI.
He was in the perfect position to understand what was coming into the investigation, as well as what he could observe maybe from above the investigation.
I want to talk about Watergate.
We're not going to talk about that subject.
All the president's men created a sense of danger. They were constantly risking things by trying to find out the truth.
You can trust me, you know that.
The other thing the movie did was create that expression, follow the money.
Just follow the money.
And put it into American culture.
Deep Throat made it clear that the money was important, that there was a trail to follow. And Carl established that a $25,000 check had actually gone into the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars.
The $25,000 check linked contributions to President Nixon's re-election campaign to the slush fund used to pay the burglars who broke into the Watergate office complex.
I said, oh my God, this now establishes an undeniable connection between the committee for Nixon's re-election and the burglars.
John Mitchell was the Attorney General. He was a Nixon loyalist.
The highest law enforcement officer in America controlled a secret fund that paid for undercover activities against Nixon's political opponents. Bradley said they're about to call the Attorney General of the United States a crook. There's never been a story like this in our history. And we took a deep breath and said, yeah.
ABC News has projected that Richard Nixon has in fact been re-elected to the presidency to a second term. So the question now, I suppose, is how big will Mr. Nixon win?
It was a giant landslide. There was virtually no reaction to the stories we did. And it was a way of saying, Watergate, Who cares?
And whatever happened to Watergate?
I don't know. I don't know. Apparently nothing. They've got a trial of the accused in that case, and that's going to be tried in due course, and I think that's probably the end of the story.
Okay. Well, what happened was, in fact, yes, Nixon ended up having to resign. It turned out that he had knowledge of what was going on and had tried to get the CIA to help cover it up. All right, so here's the resignation. He gives his resignation speech, and what I want to look at is what can we see about it from a language point of view.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, now it came in around, as you can see on the screen here, it was early on that he actually said, I will resign. And you can see the word cloud at the top, sort of the kinds of things that he talked about. Now, this was televised, and he was reading the speech, and it was prepared beforehand. The first 8 paragraphs. The 8th paragraph is where he actually says he'll resign. So the first 8 paragraphs, just that text, we can compare that with the whole text. We notice in the first 8 paragraphs that, yes, these topics, president, office, nation, they are very much predominant throughout the whole text. There are some things that are in the text which are not very much at all a part of the first 8 paragraphs. People. You don't see it even mentioned here in the first 8 paragraphs. This is the first 8 paragraphs.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shaped the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad, to continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
All right, now, just taking a look at the modal auxiliaries that have been used, and this is up through this point where he has said that he'll resign, but notice that how we see a number of would. Now, that's almost like hypothetical, all right? It's not really done, or it's not definite. Would. We notice a few must and one, I think, might, all right, which was used. Now, notice that as we move on from 8, where he says, I shall resign, we notice that modal auxiliary shall. And notice now it shifts to will. It's all been sort of hypothetical up until this point. But once he's resigned, now it's talking about the future. And we see the modal auxiliary will is used repeatedly. 17, I shall leave this office with regret. Again, you have each of these sort of, at these sort of junctures in the speech where I shall resign, I shall leave this office with regret, and it carries on. And again, we notice quite a few examples of will.
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud. Achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for a quarter of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the...
All right, now, notice that it carries on, and it will, and again, it's looking forward to the future, and it even some points where it's mainly talking about his accomplishments. It's also, at some points, he even smiles. It seems very upbeat. It seems very positive. Something else I want you to notice. Besides the use of the modal auxiliaries, there's another pattern here. And you'll notice that in the use of the pronouns, just a few examples of third person. He's referring to the one who will replace him. Not very much. But you'll notice that the first person occurs throughout the text, except in this section, which we just were listening to, where he's talking about his achievements. It is now no longer in first person. It is only first person plural, we. This whole section here does not mention himself first person once. It is almost like a completely different part of the text. And it's here that he's talking about his accomplishments, like it has nothing to do with the resignation. Again, noticing some aspects of the word cloud. When he gets to the end, again, it shifts back, and now it's back to the first person. When we look at it in terms of the use of modal auxiliaries, we see a pattern. The shifts from up until where he says, I will resign, it's all rather, it's not definite. It's still hypothetical until he gets to that point. He says he'll resign, and then he's talking about the future. It's very future oriented. And when he gets to that block from 17 onwards, where he then shifts to we, you'll notice it's marked by I shall, and then it carries on we, and all about his accomplishments. The last part.
For more than a quarter of a century in public life.
Now I want you to notice something. He has just been talking about we and our and the country and all the achievements that have been made and all the sort of positive aspects. But I want you to notice the gap between that ending and this part where he begins. Listen.
For more than a quarter of a century in public life,
there's a noticeable break. The text itself is made up of parts. There are different phases, we could say, within the text. And that is indicated by the use of the modal auxiliaries. It's indicated by the use of the referential pronouns, whether it's first person singular or first person plural. This illustrates at the bottom here is one other point I wanted to make, and that is at the bottom you can see the choices of theme. On the top you can see just the use of pronoun. This is not necessarily in theme position, but in the lower box that you see illustrated there, that is theme. Now you notice that first person is not very much theme. We is theme. Another point to make is that you'll see that a lot of theme is related to circumstance. Adjuncts of circumstantial theme. The subject itself is circumstantial. This is the 37th time. Dependent clauses as circumstantial theme. In other words, the circumstances. He's framing this resignation in terms of the circumstances which forced him to resign. The language itself has a particular character because of the nature of what is being talked about, because of the way it's being presented. I want to just close on, and this was the response after the resignation. I want you to listen. How did people respond?
And so, Richard Milhouse Nixon has resigned as the 37th President of the United States, effective at when Gerald Ford, the Vice President, will be sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. It was a 16-minute speech in which the President seemed calm but controlling, obviously, very deep emotions. He did not, I think my colleagues will agree, confess any crimes in regard to the Watergate or any other matters. He said that he was guilty perhaps of some bad judgment, but that was all. Eric?
Yes, there have been no further admissions. Perhaps it was foolish for people on the Hill and some of us to think that there might have been. He has said, in effect, he is not resigning because of a sense of guilt, of any criminality, but because his political base has eroded in the Congress, and he could not be effective even if he went on through the long periods of impeachment and trial in the Senate. And therefore, it's best to cut this thing short in the interest of the whole country. On the whole, it seemed to me as effective, as magnanimous a speech as Mr. Nixon has ever made. And I suppose there'll be many, even among his critics, who will say that perhaps that few things in his presidency became him as much as his manner of leaving the presidency. Certainly no attacks on his enemies, none on the press, as we did have from Vice President Agnew a year ago when he resigned. I think people will find it very hard to fault this. A man is certainly entitled to call attention with his last words as president to what he considers his positive acts, which are those of trying to make peace in this world. Obviously, that is how he wishes to be remembered. And perhaps that will be the positive side of his record, even for many years to come, I think.
It certainly was a conciliatory speech. He even paid tribute to those who have been in opposition to him, which hasn't always been the case with President Nixon's speeches, and said he was sure that their interests in the country were the same as his, but they approached the problem from different viewpoints. Dan Rather, our White House correspondent, Roger Mudd, our Capitol Hill correspondent, are with us also, along with Eric, in the studio here in Washington. Gentlemen, your reactions for tonight's speech.
Walter, I think it may very well go down when history takes a look at it as one of Richard Nixon's, if not his finest hour. Needs to be made clear and can't be reemphasized too often, I think, as I think the President made clear in his speech. There is no joy in this for anyone tonight. No decent thinking American could take any joy out of this. That sadness is tempered by, for many, with awe for the constitutional process, what we sometimes call the system, which worked magnificently. It was that constitutional process, it was a process of law, which brought us to this moment. The President in his speech made clear that he respects that, he understands that, he has that appreciation and that awe for it. He did give, and I would agree with Walter, what you said, he gave to this moment a touch of class, more than that, a touch of majesty, touching that nerve in most people that says to their brain, we revere the presidency, we respect the president, the republic, and the country comes first.
It's quite surprising in terms of the response. Touch of class. The response was, and this was, I mean, these people in the news and so forth, these would have been among the most critical of Richard Nixon. There was no good relationship between the press and the president. But you'll notice the response itself was very positive. We look at the speech, we look at the way in which it was put together, we look at the text itself. It accomplished its purpose. Language is a part of it. The use of modality, the references, how the speech was more or less put together in such a way as to emphasize the positive in what was a very negative situation. So it's an interesting text to look at, and interesting in terms of where it fits and how it accomplished the purpose that it was intended to serve. Remind you before I depart, we depart, and that is you have the assignment due on the 24th, and that will be on Wednesday. Please remember, and please be starting to think about your commentary And please be working on it. Because we have the Easter break, you have a bit longer to be working on it. Week 12 is really, and there is a week in between. So this won't be due until the 14th of April. But still be working on it, be thinking about it. And if you have questions, please ask them next week. Next week will be our week 11 and before the Easter break. And so we will talk more then. All right. So say good night for now, and see you next week.
Thank you very much. See
Good
you
night.
next.